Okay, so hi, my name is Brooke Savona. I currently work at Acquia. I'm a project manager in our professional services division, so we typically do consulting. So we're kind of the arm at Acquia that when we have large clients who want to use one of our products that maybe we haven't used a lot or they have huge kind of demand, we use sometimes our subcontractors or partners to do implementation, but our professional services group takes the big ones and the complicated ones and the hard ones are ones that need hand-holding. So that's the group I work in. I have 10 years experience doing web and infrastructure in different industries, so only recently Drupal. And I spent most of my years delivering projects in a waterfall methodology. So I've had previous companies that tried to move to Agile, but like Agile using like SharePoint lists, not using Jira and fun other tools. So they didn't really embrace it that well. But Acquia is the first company I've worked with that actually I think does Agile right. So I kind of wanted to share what we do for Agile and how we embrace some things in Waterfall as well. So I'll explain why I don't always do Agile, but when I do it like Waterfall. So before I get started, I just wanted to know how many people are project managers in the room? Okay, I get kind of project managery. People familiar with Jira? Okay, let me see some number. Okay. Let's get started. And that looks super weird on my notes, but that's okay. Okay, so for me, switching to Agile was a bit of a learning curve at first, but I find it helps to break things up into smaller chunks when you're trying to deliver large projects. And I really like parts of Agile, like the sprint planning meetings, the daily scrums, sprint reviews, retrospectives. There are some great things in Agile, which I think really help with project delivery. But I think there's things in Waterfall that are useful to bring over to Agile as well. For example, in Waterfall, you want a detailed schedule, scope planning, and all of that at the beginning of the engagement. In Agile, you also want to do some planning up front, but I find that it's most important to plan for your MVP. So of everything you need to deliver, what is the minimum you need to deliver to give something valuable to the company? Because if you don't at least do that, you kind of fail at what your original intent was. So in Waterfall, you also have sequential design, build, test, and deploy processes. And while this is done iteratively in Agile, it's important to know some of your design and architecture up front so you know kind of where you're going. And I also, at the end of Agile, before you launch your MVP or anything, to do a round of UAT that's kind of outside of what you would usually do within a sprint. Also, Agile's typically light on documentation. I think people use it as an excuse not to write them. But while Waterfall relies heavily on it, but documentation in your tickets especially, in architecture documents, support guides, and within your code is really important to the ongoing maintenance of whatever you just built using Agile. Okay. So this is a high-level overview of kind of what we're going through today. I'll cover it at the end and I'll reference it as we go through so people don't feel like you need to memorize this or anything. And we start with getting started. So the first thing in getting started in Acquia's realm in professional services is with contract signature. So we tend to have groups before contract signature that do kind of a scoping, they check the viability of the client. We tend to get started on contracts before it's handed over to us, but usually you have someone in our group review it before it's signed to make sure there's a sanity test on the what we say we're delivering at a high level makes sense and the timeline makes sense and we're not over-committing to things. So there's two types of contracts we tend to deal with. The ones that we like better in our professional services group are the time and materials ones. It's less risky for the delivery team since you're paid for the work as it's performed. There's more risk for the client because you could run out of money and still not have MVP. It's not a good relationship, but it is something that could happen. The key is to track the burn down of hours and costs versus the remaining scope of work. So if you've spent 50% of your budget, but you're tracking MVP and you're only 20% done, you know pretty early that you have a problem, and those discussions can be made to make sure that you're prioritizing with the time you have left the things that are most important to the client. Fixed fee contracts happen. They are not the favorite for our delivery teams because we take on a lot of the risk. So sometimes if our pre-sales group or we underestimated how difficult the implementation would be, you can be stuck at the end doing a lot of work for free. So that tends to be where we get at the end, is sometimes you have to have, 3 or 4 extra developers come on to finish everything, and you aren't getting paid for those hours. So making sure that you have that sorted out is important for fixed fee. Our problem there also is typically you get paid on milestones. So if you don't always agree that that milestone's been met, that can sometimes cause issues too. So, you were supposed to deliver this connector, but maybe not everything is finished, so they hold up payment. So that can also be kind of difficult when we do fixed fee contracts. So we tend to like time and materials better. With both contracts, it's really important to confirm what's in scope, but also what's out of scope. Too many people assume that something will be done. So if there's anything that worries you, making sure that's brought up in the beginning so someone knows you intend not to do that for them. And then one thing that's also really important is I find after the contract's signed, everyone's like, okay, let's get started right away. And a lot of the times you don't quite have the people available or ready. So making sure that the second the contract's signed, you might not be able to start immediately. So setting expectations there and giving yourself enough time to onboard and ramp up your team is also really important. So once we have a contract and we're ready to go, the first thing we tend to do is kick off our project. So I think it's one of the most important aspects of a project because you want to start with making sure that everybody's on the same team. One thing that we like to do is, when I say kickoff, I don't just mean with your client. I think that it's important first to have a kickoff with your internal team. So once you have your developers and the people who are going to be working on your project, meet with them first. Because you don't want them to get into a kickoff meeting and then be completely confused by what they're supposed to be doing too. So you want to present a united front. One thing that's also important is, as much as possible, if you have the time and budget, traveling to your client so you can meet them in person. I think that really helps build relationships. If you can't be there in person, video chat or something where you can see the people. Some people are opposed to video chat, at least having like a picture and what they do in your slides. So trying to get some more camaraderie with your client really helps with the difficult conversations down the road. So some of the things that we like to focus on when you get into a kickoff are scope, timeline, resources, communication, and reporting. So for scope, you need to determine what constitutes project success. So why are you doing the project and what do you expect to get out of it? Not just the technical requirements, but why you need something. So if they say we need an e-commerce site, if they said we currently have a tool that can't handle our volume well, doesn't have reporting that we need, and doesn't accept all the payment methods we have, that's way more useful than we need e-commerce. So making sure that you understand not just the technical reason, but also the business value that you're trying to deliver to them. This way, when you deliver your project, you can focus on the things that they were concerned about, not just we got through this checklist. Timeline. Understand if there are any promises or delivery dates already set in stone. So sometimes before you even talk about anything, someone's like, yep, we're going live July 31st, and you can't change that. So it's good to know those things. Especially, and it'd be nice to know if that's flexible at all, and if there's any other projects that you're dependent on or might hold you up. So in some instances, maybe you have a design that you're waiting for, but it's not done yet. So it's important to know whether that's something that could put a risk to your timeline as well. Next is resources. So understanding who the key players are and what their roles and responsibilities will be. And ensure everyone is committed to success and empowered to perform their role. So I've had a few situations where someone will be called a product owner, but they don't want to write tickets, they can't make decisions, and they have to ask everyone for everything. That's not a product owner. So So making sure that everyone understands that if that's the role you're assigned, you're empowered to actually perform that role. And those things should be identified up front, because otherwise you're going to have a lot of delays down the road where someone's always trying to ask for someone else's opinion. Next is communication, which is probably one of the most important aspects. So you want to identify when you need to meet on a regular basis, what sort of reporting is required, which tools are you going to use. So are you going to use Slack, Jira, video chat? Is travel in your budget? How often should you go out for that? And if you have good communication and rapport with your client, it makes it much easier to handle situations as they arise. I was talking to Olaf earlier about how we had a very difficult client. But worked out really well is they really liked playing board games when we were on site. So we used to do board game nights like 2 or 3 times when we were on site with the client. And what was really nice is you didn't talk about work at all. We just had fun. And so the next day, if we had a really difficult conversation, we were already kind of friendly. So you can tell me all of your problems and we're not really mad at each other. We're just talking about them. And I think that those types of kind of unofficial rapport with your client really helps when you have problems. And the last is reporting, so just making sure you know if you need to do weekly status reports, everything it needs to include, and if there's any executive reporting or steering committees that you need to be aware of, just to know the frequency with which you need to report. Okay. So once we are finished with kickoff, what we tend to do at Acquia is a discovery phase. So typically there's been some pre-sales, this is what we're going to deliver type conversations, but your delivery team hasn't always been embedded in that. So what we tend to do is after kickoff, we have 2 to 3 weeks of a discovery phase. We tend to like to start that on site. So if you're on site for your kickoff, spend the next few days deep diving into what we said we were going to deliver to see if there's any gaps that we haven't thought about. So maybe everyone had the intention that we were going to use this site in English in this country for the site, and then they're like, you know what, I think I'd rather use the UK one. Okay, I mean, it's early enough that you can make those decisions, but you need to figure out all of the ramifications for that. Or something someone didn't think about, an aspect of the project, or a different content type, or a different layout. There's a lot of things that might come up once they actually sit down and talk, because I think a lot of the times the contracts are done at higher levels, and as soon as you get both teams that are actually doing the work in the same room, they can talk a little bit more candidly and find the gaps. So usually we do a couple days discovery on site, and then we tend to produce a discovery report after that makes sure we understand everything that they went through. We also call that Sprint 0, so that's where we're setting things up. So setting up the infrastructure, onboarding the development team, getting their local environment set up so that when we actually start the first sprint, we're doing development work and not prep. And this is just because these are some faces I've seen when people get really confused during discovery. So that's how we get started. So we discover, we kick off, and we have steps. Now we go into development sprints. So the first thing we do is backlog grooming. So I hope people know what backlog grooming is, but if not, it's when the product owner and other people on the team go through the backlog, so the items of things you're going to deliver, and make sure it contains things that are appropriate, they're prioritized, and that the top of the list are actually ready to start working on. These sessions should take place as often as needed. I find that we usually do about once or twice a week when we're in the middle of a project. In the beginning, we tend to do that a lot more because you want to make sure you at least have a couple sprints groomed so that you're not running behind all the time. And you also want to try to identify if there's any risks to project scope or timeline. So if someone puts a ticket in for something that wasn't quite in the original scope, making sure that's identified. You're happy to do that, but we're not tagging it MVP. So what makes a well-groomed ticket? So I find that this is some of the hardest things for people that are new to Agile to get into, that you can't just write, I need a homepage hero. That's not a ticket. That's a statement of something that you might want. So typically, I don't know if people have heard of invest, but you should invest in good user stories. So first, they should be as independent as possible. So we try to think of things can be delivered by themselves, where you don't need like 12 tickets in order to deliver something. I realize sometimes that does happen, and sometimes there's prerequisites, but as much as possible, making sure that they are independent deliveries. Negotiable. So it is not a contract. It's an invitation for us to have a conversation about something. So the story should capture the essence of what's desired, but not how to do it. So a business person shouldn't say, I want a homepage here and this is exactly how I want it done. They should say that they want one, and then we can talk about what's the best way to deliver that. So a good example of this is, it actually was to do with the homepage hero, but we were at a client, and she asked about this ticket and why is that not ready yet? This is what she wanted. And our technical architect was there, and he said, oh, well, I was going to put that in the bad idea epic. And our account manager almost slapped him, like, you're telling her she has bad ideas? And she goes, oh, well, why would you do that? And he said, you know, you have an H1 in here, and that doesn't make sense, and there's these implications, and he was going through stuff, and she goes, oh, yeah, okay, so that is a bad idea. So how would you say we do that better? And I think that those are the types of conversations that need to be had. You're there to provide value, not to just do what they ask. So sometimes, while I don't know I'd call it a bad idea epic when someone suggests stuff to you, those are the important things to talk about. Estimatable. So make sure that it's something that you can do in a sprint. So sometimes if something's really big, you should try to split it up into smaller chunks. That's not always feasible because sometimes you're not really sure how you're delivering that yet. So what we tend to do at Acquia sometimes is we put in a ticket that has the word spike in the front. And spike means that you are not producing code, you're producing ideas. So it's a document, or maybe you'll have more tickets out of it, but you're not actually putting in a PR for anything. It's just to think about stuff. Because honestly, if you just thought about it during the sprint, you're probably taking your velocity away from other things, because who knows how long you could sit there and think. So it's nice to have something scheduled so you actually have time for it, and it doesn't take away from your velocity and puts focus on the fact that you need to focus on that. Small. So obviously with estimatable, make sure they're small enough to deliver within a sprint. I won't really talk about estimating story points or anything right now, but typically if a sprint is going to be 2 weeks, don't have anything take longer than a week, because you need to put in a PR, code review, test it, send it back. There's a lot of things that are done, so you don't want to say, oh, we have 2 weeks. Anything that's smaller than 2 weeks is good, because that is not enough time to get everything done. Testable. So can it be tested? One thing I like to emphasize with this is our developers, as they are going through their stories, should help write testing steps. And then you should test your own stuff to make sure you pass the testing steps. So the first time something's tested is not when a QA tester gets it, it's when you think you're done and you think you passed your steps. And the QA tester can test for more things or enhance it, but you should start as a developer thinking through how someone would test this to make sure that you think you're passing the acceptance criteria. And so I have an example up here of what a well-groomed story might look like. It's not perfect, but there's some stuff. So credit card payment processing. Descriptive yet succinct, so don't write credit card payment processing of these 5 things, just something simple. A user story from the business perspective, so as a type of user, I want some goal for some reason. All required assets. For example, attaching a mock-up. So if someone describes something they want, it's really helpful for them to include pictures, because sometimes the way you're talking about something isn't the way we think that you want it. So as many pictures as possible is better, especially if you're doing bugs and you think something's like off by a few pixels, or this color or sizing isn't right. If you can put a picture of what you see, that's super helpful, because sometimes it's hard to reproduce those things. And size to complete in a single sprint. I won't talk about estimation because I don't think I have a way I like to do story points consistently throughout projects, so I won't quite get into that. Sometimes it's fun to estimate as a group, or just the tech lead, or just a few people, so I'm happy to talk about that sometime. Is that actually the press? I will just hit the button. Okay. For people who are Jira people, I love custom Jira boards, and I could talk about these forever. So this is one custom Jira board that I absolutely do for every single project. So a lot of the times if you have everything on one board, it's really, really hard to follow. So I like to hold my backlog grooming meetings with a board that only shows the things that need to be groomed. So I typically do a Kanban board, so it shows all the tickets, even if you're doing Scrum, Kanban board to show everything. And then I set custom JQuil filters to show by sprint. So if we're starting sprint 1, I could see 2 already. 1 we still need to talk about, so we'll bring that up first in the meeting. Story approval, let's go through it quickly. Someone should just be able to say go. And then start looking at your next sprint. I usually put a bunch of them in there so that you know if you're getting close to ready. And if you have sprint 1 starting in a week and sprint 2 hasn't even started any of the grooming, you might know you need more meetings. So it does kind of help everyone focus on what needs to be groomed next. And another thing I like to do is if you have an hour of a backlog grooming meeting, you should have 2 hours ahead of time just looking at them. So I find that as a project manager, if you get into a backlog grooming meeting and you haven't looked at it yet, you're trying to figure it out in your head. Whereas I actually like to go in the tickets and put like in red comments of everything I think I might ask during the meeting, so that it helps when you get there. Everyone's like, oh, that's a no, that's a yes, these 3 things. It makes it so the conversation goes really fast because backlog grooming meetings are typically a lot of people taking a lot of time talking about the same thing, so try to make that as efficient as possible.
What's your JQL to grab the tickets that are tagged with a sprint?
You can't put the sprint name, you have to just put the sprint code. I can show you after. Typically, it's just, you want to make sure your stories are at least assigned to sprint, but it's just if sprint equals this.
Oh, so do you use the sprint planning view to put them in a sprint, and then this show, and then...
Yeah, so you use your backlog view to put them in a sprint, because typically you only really have your next sprint, and maybe you kind of rough out what your sprint after will be. The business can move stuff around, but you probably have a decent idea of what you think you need to do next.
And then when you start that sprint, do you use the sprint board?
Then you use the sprint board. This is just for backlog grooming meetings, and it's just because otherwise all the other fields kind of clutter everything. I only want you to look at this, and I only want you to look at the next sprint first. So it just has people focus, because I don't care about the rest of the backlog right now. I care about what we're starting in a week that we have no idea the final requirements on. I create a whole bunch of custom boards. This is just my favorite.
I've done something similar. I get this. Is cool.
Yep.
I didn't know you could make a Kanban board.
In Agile, it's so much fun. I do Kanban boards too. I actually wanted to do a session just on too many boards. You can do some just for your testers. So sometimes testers get confused with things, especially UAT testers. I usually do Kanban boards for them so they could see everything. So it's kind of fun. So once you have your backlog groomed, which you're going to do all the time, you start planning for your sprints. So at the start of the sprint, the product owner, in collaboration with the project team, selects and prioritizes the work you're going to do the next sprint. And it should be agreed that if we complete all of the things we said we would, we are successful. So you can't say you didn't want these 5 things should have been in it, because we all agree. And this is how I tend to get people to agree. So a lot of the times in Jira as well, when you're in a sprint, you try not to, but sometimes things go in and out. It's good to have a record of exactly what you agreed to in this meeting. So I start with a sprint goal, something human readable. So if someone says, oh, what are you doing in sprint 1? You're doing that. So it's not like I'm doing these 50 tickets and I have to read them off to you. So sprint 1 typically is we're going to start creating content types, in this example 5, to enable the start of content entry by sprint 2. So why are you doing that now? We'll also begin by creating the style guide and the site branding, and validate infrastructure setup and configuration. So one thing that you can see from this is I'm trying to include a bunch of different aspects. So typically you'll have front-end and back-end developers. Try to make sure that there's a reasonable balance of work for them. I find that in the beginning, I tend to get a whole bunch of back-end stuff. And in the end, when everyone has a whole bunch of styling bugs, it's very front-end. So trying to balance that as much as possible. So it might not be the most high priority item, but it might be the highest priority front end item. So sometimes it's nice to use tags for that. And as soon as possible, making sure people can start putting content in. A lot of the times you might think of content types and build them out, but as soon as someone goes to put content in, they're like, yeah, we're missing this field, sorry. And it would be helpful if this had a drop down. And so I think that the sooner that they can get their hands on things like that, the people who will actually be doing the work, the better you can get those finalized. So don't wait too long to do stuff like that. Also keep an eye out for tickets with dependencies. So I find a lot of times you'll get in the middle of a sprint and it's like, oh yeah, you can't test that because we don't have these few stories in. So the more you can link things, especially if you're using Jira, the better, so that you can actually have an idea of where you might become blocked. Next, we have development phase. I like cats. Okay. So in the development phase, the things we tend to focus on are actual development. So back-end tasks, front-end tasks, architecture, infrastructure, doing actual development. And then at Acquia, and I assume at most other companies, you don't just take someone's code and put it right into an environment. You have someone doing a code review. So we have technical architects, but usually there's someone who's making sure it's accurate, it's bug-free, it adheres to coding standards, probably passes some sort of CI tool if you're using one, and follows the implementation details provided. So sometimes there might be a reason you want something implemented some way. I think a good example is a front-end person kind of hard coding colors instead of referencing style guides. So things like that, making sure it's actually done the way you wanted it. Then if that passes, you can go on to QA. Your QA person will test it to make sure it adheres to what was said in the acceptance criteria. And then that's all you would do within a sprint. I know that in some situations people do UAT within sprints, but I don't think anyone should touch it from a user perspective until you have the entire sprint delivered and you show them how it works. So if you demo it to them, they have a better idea of what you did deliver, and it kind of makes that run more smoothly. Also, you don't want it to affect your burn down. You don't want to have to wait on a user to pass something in order to actually have something done in a sprint. You're done if you're finished from the development perspective. So typically, I think everyone's seen burn down charts. I have seen them burn up. Don't do that. It means that people are adding tickets without taking out a corresponding value or increasing the story point value and also not trying to balance that. So be careful of that. I also find sometimes things are flat. If things have been flat for a few days, it's helpful to figure out, is there an environment issue where you can't deploy or where you can't test? Or is someone stuck by a dependency somewhere? So if you stay flat for a couple days, figure out where you're stuck. I think that's when people kind of get into the Kanban mentality too with column limits. So sometimes you might see that maybe 10 things are in progress, and maybe those things are all just stuck somewhere and they need to do one or two things and they just keep taking another ticket because they're not quite done. So making sure if you see one column that has too many things that you focus on moving them to the next one, because otherwise you'll never really finish. And at the end of the sprint demo, one thing that's kind of useful is in here I have include in the sprint demo. It kind of gets people thinking if they need to demo this at the end of a sprint, and some things just aren't demoable. So making sure that people shouldn't expect that thing to be shown to them. Okay, there's a couple other things in Jira I kind of like. I'll go through these quickly. If you've ever looked at velocity charts, it's sometimes hard to tell how many points that you should commit to up front. And usually it takes a couple sprints to get a feel of it, but this chart's interesting to look at so you can kind of see, have you overcommitted and underdelivered, or undercommitted and overdelivered, which is better, to make sure that you kind of stick with the same thing. So once you start seeing trends, you might be like, you know what, let's kind of aim for about 55, 60, maybe 55, because this way if something comes in the sprint, maybe we could just say we'll take it and we don't make them move anything. So trying to make sure that you have an idea of where you might be. And then release burn down charts. They're slightly more complicated, but if you set them up correctly, they're super helpful. So we tend to tag anything that's MVP. Put whatever you want in the system, even if it's pie in the sky, I want it to sparkle and shoot fireworks. That's fine. It's not MVP. So mark whatever is MVP in your system. And as you start doing that, it takes about 3 sprints for this to populate, but it'll start projecting when you'll end the project, because it realizes how many points you tend to put in each sprint, how many points you're completing, and it starts saying, you know what, you're going to be done in about 2 sprints. So if you only have 1 sprint left, panic. If you have 3 sprints left, you're probably good. You know, bugs are going to be added, it'll be fine. So that is really useful, but you have to tag a release for anything in that release for it to start showing up. User acceptance testing. So once you've done the demo, anything that you have demoed, a user should then be able to test. I have had issues in the past where people demoed locally. Try not to do that. Unless it actually works in a live environment, it doesn't actually work. So making sure that once they see something, they can then get their hands on it and confirm that that's all working. There's 2 types of user acceptance tests in Agile, especially the way we do it. Sometimes users get confused. So one is of sprint tickets. So when a sprint is done, you then test those tickets. Then there is the other UAT, which is after everything's done, a sanity check that everything's working before you go live the first time. Because you've been testing all along, the sanity check shouldn't be like months of time. You should be testing all along. That's been a hard concept to grasp for some of our people. It's good to time box this activity, so don't give them forever to test, because quick feedback's really important. So for example, if you did those content types and people haven't started putting content in, you don't want to get like 4 sprints in when they start putting in content and like, I'm missing a bunch of fields. The sooner you can know that, the sooner you kind of back yourself into a corner. You won't back yourself into a corner because you'll have really quick feedback on what should be done there. So in UAT, one of the things that I find most useful to explain to people is when you should fail a ticket. So I feel like people like to fail things all the time because it should also do this. Or I found a styling issue on that page completely unrelated to the thing that's listed in the acceptance criteria. Or that's not what I mean when I wrote it, but that is what it says. So tickets should only be judged on their adherence to the acceptance criteria. For example, if you asked for a button to be red and it's purple, then yes, that's a failure. So very simplistic, but that's a failure. However, if it's red, but the developer assumed it was a square, because most buttons are, and you wanted an octagon, that is not a failure. You can put a ticket in for that, that's perfectly fine, but that might not be the most important thing for them to work on next. So if you fail it and say, should have been an octagon, that's going to go back in the sprint, it's taking time away from other things you need, and it really might not be that much of a priority, and it gets super messy, because if you have a ticket that's failed like 5 times, and you have to read through the comments to see what everyone is mad about, it's really inefficient. So if there is not an explicit reason for something to be failed with the acceptance criteria, put another ticket in. It doesn't mean it still can't get done, it just means it might not be the most important thing right now. Okay, so we went through getting started, we went through our development sprints. Those happen many, many times, so you'll be doing that for a little while. Once you start getting to the end of the development phase, we are going into our launch phase and preparing for that. So make sure you give yourself time for pre-launch activities. So first we do bug fixing and audit sprints. It's really hard to find a picture for that one. So after all features are developed, there's still bug fixing to do, and this should be after you feature freezed. So this means that there's no new development or enhancements. You're just working on bugs. So when you get into this, you want to make sure the most important thing is you have a backlog of bugs and that your product owner has identified which ones are showstoppers, because those should be the ones you focus on, things that are going to block your go live. You should work from the top of the list to make sure those items are the ones that you handle first. I think one thing to note with this is sometimes you might have like 50 bugs, and if 30 of them are styling issues, they might be low. but when all put together in aggregate, it can provide a really poor user experience. So just because there's 30 lows doesn't mean you need to ignore them. You might actually need to start focusing on some of them, because if you launch the site and you have people saying, well, this button's misaligned, this isn't working, the font's different here, all of these things just have a poor perception. So you should pay attention to that too. Things might not be a showstopper themselves, but you might need time to kind of make it a little less buggy. You should also focus on performance and load testing during this sprint. So you should make sure your infrastructure is sized appropriately, ensure you're on the same page. You might have contractual obligations for how quickly pages need to load. Maybe it's like 3 seconds for a regular page or 7 seconds for search. Just make sure you're all on the same page with that. I also like to gather user journeys when you're doing that sort of testing. So if you're an e-commerce site, you should probably test a common thing that people will do with e-commerce. So go to the site, search for a product, add it to your cart, edit your cart, check out, pay, confirm. Set those types of user journeys and make sure that all looks appropriate. So we have like standard JMeter tests and stuff that we have a performance team run, but they rely on the project manager to work with the business to be like, what are the common things we should check for? Like, what would a user actually do on the site versus us just clicking all around? Also, if you're handing your project off to another team, so frequently our professional services group will go into an organization, implement, stay around for a little bit, and then go away. So a lot of what we're doing is making sure that at this phase, there should be people shadowing you so that they know what to do when you're going to go away in a few weeks. And at the end of this sprint, you should have showstoppers resolved. Any open items or new things you find, file them away, because it's very useful for someone to know what to do after live. And you should prepare for your site-wide UAT. So now we're doing launch prep. So at the end of this phase, a product owner should have reviewed the whole application to make sure that it's working. You should leave at least a week or two for the client to confirm it's complete. I've had some projects where it's like they're launching 10 sites in like 6 different languages. It takes a little bit longer and a little bit more coordinated to test because it's probably been a while since you've actually looked at all of them. So just make sure you scale that based on what you're delivering. But it should just be a simple sanity check that everything's working, because you should be testing throughout the development phase, but it is nice to do a sanity test after. Make sure your site is secure and performant. Make sure you start planning for your launch, and you should get an actual go. So there should always be a meeting that is a go or a no-go so that everyone knows we are good to go. We tend to organize ourselves with different types of categories. So we always have a launch checklist. There are some things that need to be done before we launch, some things during launch. So it's good to have a spreadsheet of everything you can think of that needs to be done. And meet usually a week or two out to make sure everyone's doing all the prep stuff. And then usually leading up to it, meet like every day to make sure if you need to coordinate DNS with a third party, they know what's happening, especially if it's like a Friday night and you can't get a hold of anyone. So making sure that all of those things are planned for way ahead of time, because a lot of these things are done in off hours and people need to be around and you need to know the coverage for things like that. It's also good because if anyone thinks of anything last minute that they're worried about, they have an avenue to talk about it, instead of just being mad and thinking we're not ready and venting to someone else. So, we launch. So you never want to launch on the last day of a project. So a lot of the times, if we plan to launch on the 31st of July, give yourself a couple weeks to still be around. So I think a lot of the time, you don't quite think through as much what happens afterwards. So what we tend to do on our side is make sure that you have a checkpoint midday after the launch. So once you're up for a few hours, it kind of gives people an avenue to vent if they see a bunch of people are complaining about this one thing or things are looking smoothly. So it's good to be able to check with people to make sure everyone feels comfortable. I find the most common things that I find after launch, which happen with a lot of people, which are not show-stopping but need to be addressed pretty quickly, are SEO. So a lot of the times it takes a couple hours before Google to recognize that you have switched everything. So making sure that you're on top of that, since that's really important to people getting out there. Redirects. So check through all your 404s and see if you forgot something, because needless to say, people always tend to forget something, especially if you changed the structure of your site significantly, making sure that all of that is redirecting appropriately. And device-specific issues. I feel like there's so many devices out there now that maybe you didn't check someone using a Google Pixel, but the extra large version, and that button doesn't work. So those types of things, depending if that's like the purchase button or just, one that's kind of read more, making sure that the most important things are working on all devices, because you can test a lot of things and hope you've got them all covered, but that doesn't always happen. Okay, so now we're on our final phase, which is transition and handoff. So once you've launched the site, your work is not done yet. If you're handing the project to a separate team, there's a bunch of things that you should be doing all along to make sure transition and handoff goes smoothly. And there'll be another huge slide if you want to take a picture later. So I just thought this is a cute little thing on a cat teaching a kid. So enablement and training. So if staff needs to be trained on a new technology, for example, if they're new to Drupal or don't have a lot of PHP skills, there are some things that you might want to plan way ahead of time if they're going to start taking over for the team. If there's subcontractor or temporary resources brought in, it's important that you do some shadowing, especially at the end, if they can do the last few deployments to prod, if they can start getting into development and integrating with your team, that's really helpful to make sure that that's smooth. What should you do for a support and escalation process when the project team goes away? So if there's a problem, who do you contact? Can you actually reach out to that team still afterwards? Because maybe there is specific knowledge that wasn't documented as well that you do need to get a hold of. So making sure you have a way for emergencies and if there's something that you really don't understand anymore. Documentation. I have no idea how that works or why they did that. It's something I hear a little too often sometimes when you switch between developers. So especially front end, I feel like they all have their own way of doing something. But making sure that you have READMEs that are really useful. So if there's a problem and you have to dig through someone's code to figure out how it links to other things or what they did there, that's very inefficient and can make it really hard to solve problems. So making sure that that is documented. And I tend to make sure during the development process, if you are submitting a PR and you haven't documented your code or written a README for a new module or anything, then you aren't done. You need to do that as part of it. I find that a lot of reasons that people don't do like README files or architecture documents is because they don't have time, which makes sense when you have a lot of deadlines and you have a lot of tickets that you need to complete in a sprint. I like to occasionally put placeholder tickets in for documentation, especially for things like the architecture document. You should kind of start in the beginning with a template of, I think a lot of us have, what we've seen common architecture documents look like before with your content types, your integrations, those types of things. Kind of framework that. And then as you're going through, maybe not the first time you're creating the content type you start populating that, but once you get a little bit ways into your project, start putting placeholders. So a ticket for 3 or 5 points or something where someone actually goes in and starts documenting this. Because if you wait till the end, maybe you've lost some of your resources or you just really don't have time to finish it. And so this is the process again. So anyone who wanted it bigger, the slides will all be online as well. So every company has their own project management process, but this is kind of what we do. So we have some things that we like to take from Waterfall, like we do upfront documentation. It's not a full-on requirements document, but we tend to try to scope out as much of MVP as possible. We try to get tickets in as soon as possible, because if you don't have all of your tickets in, you won't realize how much work you have left to do. And at the end of projects, I find there's always what I call above the line and below the line. So you have 40 story points left. These are the ones at the top. if you don't get these other ones that you thought you wanted, is that going to be a problem? So making sure that they can make the decision as to what's above and below, because they might think that something's important, but when they really see what you have left to deliver, they might decide to make a different choice. So these sessions are recorded, and I'll upload the slides, and I'll also tweet them out as well. And if anyone has any questions, you can ask her questions. It's okay. Ola?
I have a question. If you could go back to the slide before the jumping dog.
Yep.
That,
Before the jumping dog. Yeah.
Yes. So that's the first time that I see the scope freeze in there, and that is during the audit or the
It's when you finish all of the development and get to the bug fixing. So once you start getting finished development, and that's the sprint UAT, not the overall UAT, you freeze the scope and you start working only on bugs. Every once in a while you might get a showstopper in there that you might have to finagle, but for the most part, nothing new.
Okay. So doesn't that, if you only here freeze the scope, doesn't that lead to what is it called, scope creep? If you have, because this is the last sprint basically.
That's
right?
the last sprint. Well, you would have the sprint before, you would have groomed before that. So it's really about like 3 weeks before that you're not doing anything. But they can do some trade-offs in the last sprint if you want.
Okay.
It tends to happen, I find the whole below the line, above the line thing is once you start getting to the last sprint, you realize this is what we have time left to do, and you do need to make some trade-offs. But they're not allowed to add any new things at all during bug fixing. We're not accepting new requirements or any changes. Kelly, did you have a question?
No.
Oh, okay, sorry. I didn't go first. Yes?
I tried importing we do an estimation spreadsheet, so there are a ton of things from that. And so I imported those into Jira and had a zillion tickets, which was very exciting. But I felt like the developers were put off because all these tickets kind of appeared and they didn't have a chance to participate in creating them. Do you try to populate as many tickets as possible? I still feel like it was the right thing to do, but I feel like I
so typically the product owner is supposed to put tickets in. I find that a lot of the times project managers do it faster. It doesn't mean that you should ever put a ticket in and then not groom it with the client. So if you're starting some of them for them, so like you kind of know what they need for a content type, you might start that for them. Put your thoughts in, and then during a grooming session, make sure someone on the client confirms and approves beforehand. I do try to make sure that the developers, sometimes I have them in grooming, sometimes I just have the dev leads in grooming. If your team's small enough, what I kind of like to do is the sprint planning meetings before or after, or I guess after, once you've decided what's in a sprint, I like to take a couple hours of the first day to just have the developers walk through it with me, because I know why they asked for something, and this way the developers don't just get a ticket and be like, I have no idea what they're talking about, and try to figure it out themselves. I feel like a lot of the times, unless you're talking to them about it, especially without the business on, so they don't have to feel intimidated by asking questions, they sometimes might try to work it out themselves without asking first. So making sure that they feel comfortable going to you, even if the question sounds dumb, ask me anyways. So I do like to sometimes also do scrums with everybody, and then developer scrums too, so that the developers just have a one-on-one with the TA and maybe me, because I know what the business is talking about, where they can just ask questions and not feel so intimidated as well. Anything else? Okay. Sounds good. Thank you all.